What conspiracy theory would rock the world if it actually ended up being true, and how? There is a chance that Earth is part of a larger alien civilization. There's an island off the coast of Thailand called North Sentinel Island. The inhabitants of that island are the direct descendants of humans that left Africa, and they didn't have much contact with the rest of the world for the most part. Because of this, a lot of modern diseases, which most of the world is immune to, are lethal to them. They're still in the Stone Age and no one understands their language. The island is part of India, and due to the reasons I mentioned above, India does not allow visitors to this island. The Indian Navy actually enforces a no-go zone around the island to protect the inhabitants from outside who could introduce lethal diseases. The islanders do not know what India is, that they're claiming and protecting them. There hasn't been much studies done on the islanders because of lack of immunity, but in the 1800s, a British sailor did take 2 adults and 2 kids from the island to study them. The adults got sick and passed away pretty quickly, and they sent the kids back. So what if there's an alien civilization that claims our solar system and for some reason we do not know and they do not introduce themselves to us? They could be checking up on us. UFO sightings. Basically, what if the Earth is the North Sentinel Island for galactic civilization that spans across multiple star systems? Since we're on the topic of aliens, the UAP phenomena is actually human-made. But from well into the future, and we're visiting the past to study archaeologically why or how a cataclysmic event occurred, and the reason for the uptick in recent sightings is that we're getting close to that event. Another thing, there are always UFO upticks when the world is going through turmoil. First nuclear bombs being detected and huge increase in UFO sightings. Even during wars like the World Wars, there's an uptick in sightings. This is why I think it's future humans coming back. If you know when all the good events are, that's probably when you're going to come and poke around. I personally think we're going to get another world war or some type of world war light. It would make sense that we're seeing an uptick in UFOs now. It's probably future humans coming back and trying to get an understanding of an event in the past that maybe impacts their life. If it is humans from the future, then it means that at least some of us make it. I just think the world is headed to war and life after that war is going to be a lot different than it is now. None of them thought to say hi? I mean, come on. Story 2. If the government knows about and is covering up alien visitors, it's a crime against humanity. They have zero right to restrict that knowledge from us. My take on it is that if anyone is going to have alien-related stuff, it's going to be the US. Simply because of size, the reach of their military, and their space program. If there's anything alien-y that the US has, it is likely incredibly mundane. Something like a crashed drone, maybe some charred or something like that. Enough that the government knows that aliens are real, but not enough to really do anything with that information. So they don't release it because they don't want to cause a panic, because they don't have any answers or solutions to the problem. If the US just went out and said, yeah, an alien spaceship crashed in Montana sometime in the 1970s, we have 2 entities that were burned to almost nothing, a vehicle that was practically annihilated during re-entry, and nothing else. Everything was and are 2 destroyed for DNA. There's nothing salvageable in the vehicle, and it was practically sterilized of any alien bacteria during their re-entry fire. So all we have is proof of aliens. We have no idea if they're friendly or want to remove us from existence. No concept of how capable they are. No idea where they came from. We don't know if there are any more around, and that's it. People would freak out. It would cause mass panic. And to what end? Just to let people know? Ignorance is better for most people when it comes to alien crap. Well, it did happen and nobody cared. Story 3. Market economies are a way of exploiting the poorest people and they don't promote economic development nor raise the living standards. Many critics of market economies have always said that it doesn't promote economic development and it doesn't raise the material standards of living when they're implemented. Instead, according to them, market economies are just a plot of the rich and powerful to exploit the workers in order to keep them poor while they get even more rich and more powerful. The system of incentives provided by the currently dominant capitalist system encourages exploiting people as much as possible. Being exploited so much leaves poor people. Programs to lift people out of poverty are unprofitable in the short term, even though the social benefit is hugely profitable. But the way to make it big in capitalism is short-term profits above all else, so you end up with these programs being lobbied against, underfunded, and means-tested to hell. It's why conservatives will often ask, what's the return on investment? For basic stuff like ending child hunger. Mind you, none of this is controlled by cabal or whatever. It's not like there's a shadowy group controlling everything. Nothing is planned. It's just the current culture and monetary incentives interacting. It's far too common for people to use conspiracy theories and just replace the Jews with billionaires when talking about problems with capitalism. Story 4. Oh my god. The theory that we are figments of a dying person's imagination? To explain, it is theorized that when someone dies in the split second before they flatline, the brain creates an entire world to try to soften the blow. I can't find the original article, but it's similar to God in a way. I don't know the correct terminology, but one of my friends thinks about this. These are their thoughts. The universe started with a Big Bang, and scientists not knowing exactly why corresponds to when said person's death occurs. The brain continues to live for 30 seconds after everything else shuts down. The heat death of the universe could be when the brain dies, and natural disasters could be parts of the brain shutting down. Another part of the theory is that as it gets closer to death, it loses touch with emotions and reality, and we would therefore become less emotional. On to how it would shake the world. Let's say there's proof, somehow, somewhere, someone found undeniable proof. It wouldn't be taken seriously at first, no duh. Who would admit that? The brain wouldn't. Assuming, however, that it did and everyone took it seriously, mass hysteria. There's no way to save the brain as the brain, and there'll be lots of riots. Good things would happen, yes, but the brain tends to focus on the bad. Everyone would start riots, stealing, and basically the purge. Nobody would really care anymore, and people would give up. Nothing can be done to the dead. Story 5. One conspiracy theory that would undoubtedly rock the world if it turned out to be true is the idea that a powerful group of individuals or organizations secretly control and manipulate global events, including governments, economies, and major world events. This theory is often referred to as the New World Order. If evidence emerged confirming the existence of such a global cabal, it would shatter people's trust in established institutions and undermine the foundations of democracy. The revelation that key decisions affecting the world are made behind closed doors, away from public scrutiny and accountability, would generate widespread outrage and a sense of betrayal. The impact of such a revelation would likely be profound and far-reaching. Governments would face intense scrutiny and calls for radical reform, and public confidence in political leaders would be severely undermined. The global economy could experience significant disruptions as people lose faith in financial systems and institutions controlled by the alleged conspirators. Social unrest and protests would likely escalate as people demand justice and transparency. Additionally, the implications for international relations would be enormous. Countries that were once allies might view each other with suspicion, wondering who among them is part of the secretive group. Diplomatic relations could be strained and the world could witness an erosion of trust between nations on an unprecedented scale. Ultimately, the shockwaves caused by the confirmation of such a conspiracy theory would reshape the global landscape. The struggle for transparency, accountability, and a fairer distribution of power would become paramount as societies grapple with implications and strive to rebuild trust in their institutions. The truth, unfortunately, is that we are not the masters of our own destiny, so to speak. Those with the money have the power. Money, both directly and indirectly, controls all our politicians, from left to right, democratic governments to despotic dictatorships and everything in between. We try to control it through regulations, but ultimately, having or not having money rules all. And those with money have a significantly greater influence than either you or I ever could. We can elect leaders and representatives, but they're bound by the constraints of budgets. The US has the ability to raise the debt ceiling infinitely as long as the markets have confidence that that money will be paid to its lenders, bondholders, banks, etc. Yes, the Fed can increase or decrease the supply of money, but even the US is beholden to money and economic constraints. Well, that sounds pretty creepy. I hope he kinda sounds like a bot. Well, whatever, whoever it may be who wrote this is kinda on point. Probably reptilians on the top of everyone? What do you guys think? Story 6. Atlantis existed in Northwest Africa. It was the trade center of the world with advanced culture and technology of the time. It even correlates with historical maps calling it Atlantica and fits the exact description of how Plato described it, rings and all. It was named after Atlas, the world god, and Atlanteans applied gods to all over world regions. The only other one I can remember is the Middle East had a chaos god as their god, which also makes sense because they worship Baal-Hamon, who was the godchild sacrifices to Moloch were for. Scholars also say Saturn or Kronos were based on Baal-Hamon. Atlantis was apparently ripped from the bedrock by floods so massive you can still see the ripples in the sand today. And there's still water erosion of Egyptian sphinxes, which there's no competing theory for besides said Great Flood. It happened 20,000 years ago, exactly around the time there was a massive volcanic eruption just north of Africa. So Atlantis was ripped out of the earth, but beforehand, Atlantean religion had already spread across Egypt and survived. But it had first come from Atlantis along with the technology to build the pyramids, and also African deserts used to be lush in areas the flood hit. But where you see water ripples in the sand, and Africa is all where the ocean salted the earth, so nothing is able to grow in those areas. Look up pictures of the Eye of the Desert. That was supposedly Atlantis. So where does Arthur Curry fall into all of this? All jokes aside though, if you're enjoying these stories so far, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more of these stories. Story 7. That TWA Flight 800 was shot down. When a Boeing 747 mysteriously exploded in flight in, correct me if I'm wrong, 1996 off the coast of New York. The story and discrepancies. The official story is that a fuel quantity probe shorted, arced, and the jet fuel exploded. Now let me tell you why that's BS as an aircraft mechanic. Fuel quantity probes are very low voltage systems. Even if it did somehow manage to short inside the wing, you'd never get an arc off it. 2. Contrary to what Hollywood tells you, jet fuel is actually very difficult to ignite and requires very high temperatures and perfect atomization. 2. I have personally tossed a lit match into a soup can with a little jet fuel in it, and the match just floated on top, burning without igniting the fuel. 2. Jet fuel requires so much electrical energy to ignite that the igniters for startup are generally 400 Hz 3-phase. One quick jolt from an igniter will end you multiple times over. And this explosion supposedly occurred from an arc which, if it had actually occurred, wouldn't have been too much worse than a simple static shock. Eyewitness accounts. Just minutes after the explosion, 911 operators were flooded with reports that a missile had risen from the ocean, ascended into the sky, and struck an aircraft. Keep in mind this was in the 90s, where smartphones weren't a thing to spread misinformation. You mean to tell me that hundreds of people all made up the same fake event at the same time, within a 10 or 15-minute window, without mass communication? Doubtful. Additionally, a few air traffic controllers reported seeing TWA 800 on radar, with a second object accelerating towards it at an extremely high speed. The second radar signature intercepted the first, and both disappeared moments after. The wreckage. When wreckage was recovered, it put the final nail in the coffin of the official story. If a fuel tank had exploded, you would expect to see a rupture from that portion of the fuselage, that is, the body of the plane, or wing where the tank was located. However, that is not what the wreckage showed. The fuselage was riddled with hundreds of small holes, all puncturing into the aircraft, not exploding out. For those who don't know, missiles do not actually strike aircraft. They get near to it and detonate, sending out fragments which cause damage. This puncture damage is indicative of a missile strike and provides absolutely no evidence of an exploding fuel tank. Story 8. You/sympathetic civilian commented in a similar post years ago, and I saved his comment because I thought it made a lot of sense. American public education is purposely declining to promote consumerism and make a more subservient population. For example, public schools used to teach home economics, woodshop, or auto shop, but cutting the budget for these programs are going to end up with adults who don't know how to cook, so they spend all their money at restaurants. So they spend all their money on clothes, have an understanding of how tools work and make small repairs, so they spend all their money on handyman or repairman, or take care of their cars, so they spend all their money at car dealerships or auto shops, also getting ripped off because they are completely dependent on what the mechanic says instead of having their own pool of knowledge to draw from. Then you get to homework. We're teaching children and young adults it's okay to work all day at school and do additional work at home. With so many companies changing to a salaried position, it's perpetuating that it's expected to do some work at home and to not get paid for it. After all, you did it your whole life with homework, so why should the workforce be any different? Corporate greed at its finest again. Yeah, schools didn't stop teaching stuff like that, but if you think of it, knowledge is something you acquire. Schools didn't teach me how to tune my car, but I was still able to do it. Low-key thanking YouTube for this. Story 9. That the US government abandoned some 100 POWs in Vietnam and covered it up. Coming from an autobiography of a special ops soldier who claimed he was part of the planned rescue mission, supposedly Nixon was negotiating their release and the end of the war at the same time. The Vietnamese wanted to hold on to them so the Americans wouldn't just attack them after the ceasefire. Nixon wanted the war to end ASAP, so he agreed and planned to negotiate for them later. Then Watergate happened and everyone got sacked. The replacements never knew about this deal, and Vietnam never brought it up. Years later, the military uncovered it. They started training a team. A few days before the rescue, a retired CIA agent announced it to the world and said he'd personally go in and recover them. The mission was scrapped. This happened a second time a year later, in which the retired agent did actually go in and got a lot of his own private soldiers. The CIA then reported mass executions after that event. Eventually, some of the soldiers launched a lawsuit at the government. They lost. John McCain, John Kerry, and Bob Smith led the investigation and were rumored to have covered up evidence. Though this part is largely a rumor more than anything else. Story 10. I saw a link to Kyle Odom's manifesto here. It starts with his background, being a former Marine and then studying biochemistry at the University of Idaho. He went on to say that one night during deep meditation he had come into contact with an alien species in what he described as a black void. He said from that moment on, the aliens would constantly mess with him in his head. He went into great detail about his torment. He then actually tried to get help and checked himself into a mental institution. He ended up getting cleared and sent home, but this didn't stop them. He eventually found himself receiving text messages from a weird phone number to come to this church. When he arrived, he said the entire church was full of these alien beings. He decided to type up this manifesto and put an end to it by ending the pastor of the church. He ended up firing an entire magazine of hollow point bullets from point-blank range. He then boarded a plane to the White House and was arrested throwing his manifesto over the White House fence because he believed Barack Obama and many other world leaders were going through the same thing as him. Where it gets even stranger is that the pastor made a miraculous full recovery and came out perfectly fine. The entire time I was reading it, I truly felt bad for this veteran clearly going through psychosis, but the ending really made me believe he wasn't crazy. How does a trained Marine fire an entire magazine of hollow-point bullets at point-blank range, and then they make a full recovery in a couple of days? These people are literally trained to do this. Either Odom's aim was bad or the priest has immortality. Either way, I think they should have followed up with Odom's mental state because he'd really go mad after knowing the priest survived after the attack. Story 11. I think Princess Diana was ended under orders from the royal family. Diana wrote a letter shortly before her death claiming her husband was going to have her ended in a car accident. She was also dating a Muslim, with rumors of pregnancy certainly having the potential to have children, meaning the royal heir would have a Muslim half-brother. Not a big deal to normal people, a huge deal to a family based around bloodlines. The CCTV was out in the tunnel and the flashing lights blinding drivers as an intelligence-style hit. Sounds far-fetched, yet most had attached bombs to cars from scooters and get their target. It was also reported that her driver was drunk, yet on CCTV he appeared to be sober and the receipt from that evening shows him having one drink. A white Fiat Uno was speeding away at the time. A journalist and MI6 operative who lived in Spain owned one. He later turned up with 2 fatal gunshot wounds, ruled as ending himself. The father of Diana's boyfriend, who also is convinced it was a hit. There's a good documentary, an unlawful. Though I can't say I believe it all to be true, some of it is certainly interesting. It has to be remembered that Diana had more power than all the royals combined. She was literally called the Queen of Hearts, the people's princess. She actually had enough power to take down the monarchy if she chose to. She was the mother to the future king. The royals despised her. Her husband never loved her and she knew it. Whatever in love means. She commented on how she felt like breeding stock and was so miserable in that family she threw herself down the stairs. Given how the royals treated Harry's wife, it isn't hard to believe. The queen, upon hearing about Diana's death, quipped, "Sounds like someone greased her brakes." Just like that, this hugely unpredictable and uncontrollable thorn in their side vanished from their lives. If you look at it as if they were your neighbors, instead of billionaire royals who could never possibly do anything wrong and that this was a local crime story, there would be a good reason to be suspicious. Then it came out about the royals and connections to unspeakable acts. Not just Andrew, but Jimmy Savile was a close personal friend. That is a whole other story. Diana did have a secret that would blow the royal family apart according to her at the time, but that is conjecture. Diana again suspected forces would have someone's life taken. Why would you ever think this? Perhaps as her lover passed in a bizarre motorbike accident involving a wire across a road and Charles told her, "Shame about your friend's accident." So the lady thinks she's going to be ended by her husband's family. She ends up dead a few months later. The queen is literally head of a state that has intelligence agencies bump people off. She was a potential threat to the future of the monarchy and nothing good would have come from her being alive, with so many possibilities of her destroying the royal family. So yeah, I think it was an intentional hit. Story 12. I'm convinced that the Obama administration was behind the Panama Papers leaks. For those who don't remember, the Panama Papers were a huge trove of documents that were leaked to the media in 2016 from a law firm that helped the ultra-rich create shell companies to hide their wealth from taxes. The documents exposed an enormous amount of corruption everywhere, but was particularly damning in its revelations about authoritarian governments in Russia in particular. The leaker was completely anonymous to the point where the journalists who reported on the story do not know their identity. I fully believe that the mystery leaker was actually the U.S. intelligence community, and the decision to do it was made at the high levels of the Obama administration. The leak was huge and complex, and it mainly exposed U.S. adversaries, while at the same time, not really affecting many Americans because in the U.S., egregious tax avoidance is completely legal. It happened in early 2016, at a time that would have been the Obama administration's foreign policy team's final window to do something before the elections in the fall and the transfer of power. On top of that, the idea of a global war on corruption has been a hobby horse of many of Obama's top foreign policy advisors since leaving office. It also somehow just feels like the kind of idealistic thing they would have done. Like the belief that the truth will out and all you need to do is shine a light and things will improve is very 08 hope and change Obama. The Panama Papers feel like the kind of thing you do on your way out the door to recapture the idealism that you had to compromise on over the previous 8 years. Why does this matter? Who cares if it was U.S. intelligence and not a whistleblower behind a well-meaning but ultimately disappointing disclosure about the crimes of the global rich? Well, in the days immediately following the start of the Panama Papers reporting in April of 2016, a different and arguably more influential hack and leak operation began. Russian intelligence's fancy bear hack of the DNC servers. If the US was responsible for a hack that deeply embarrassed Putin and disrupted his finances, it definitely shades your understanding of his decision to disrupt the US election to hurt Obama's chosen successor by releasing embarrassing information. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're gonna love this. Catch you in that video.